All right, let's dive right into one of the most fundamental, most fascinating questions in all of ecology. We're talking about a debate that has literally shaped how we see the natural world for over 100 years. I want you to picture a forest. Really think about it. Is that forest a single living thing, a highly coordinated superorganism where every single tree, every insect, every fungus has a specific job, kind of like cells in a body? Or is it more like a busy town square, just a random collection of individuals who happen to be in the same place at the same time, each one just looking out for itself? That question right there is the very soul of community ecology. So, before we can really get into this epic debate, we need to make sure we're all on the same page. Let's start with the basics. What in the world is an ecological community? At its heart, it's pretty simple. A community is just a group, an assemblage of different species that are all living in the same spot and, crucially, interacting with each other, through things like predation, competition, all that good stuff. But here's the most important thing to get. These communities are not static photographs. They're living, breathing, dynamic systems that are in a constant state of change. Okay, now for the main event. Picture this. It's the early 20th century, and two ecologists come along with two completely, radically different ways of seeing these communities. It really set the stage for a classic scientific showdown. So, in one corner, we have Frederick Clements and his organistic concept. He argued that a community is, for all intents and purposes, a superorganism. He saw all the species as being tightly woven together, like organs inside a body, all working in concert. In his world, communities had sharp, clear borders, and they developed along a very predictable path, a process called succession, towards this final, stable climax community. But then, just a decade later, Henry Gleason came along and basically said, hold on a minute. He proposed the individualistic concept. In his view, a community isn't some grand, unified organism at all. Nope. It's just a coincidental gathering. Each species is only there because its own unique needs for things like temperature or moisture or sunlight happen to be met in that one spot. So the boundaries, they're not sharp at all. They're fuzzy, gradual, and the whole system is open and way more fluid. And when you put these two ideas side by side like this, the conflict just pops right out at you. You've got Clements on one side with his superorganism, a predictable, closed-off system with really distinct borders. And then you've got Gleason's species assemblage, a flexible, open collection of individuals with gradual, overlapping boundaries. And they were just as divided on how communities change over time. For Clements, it was a set, deterministic path. For Gleason, it was a much more flexible process, one that really depended on chance and who could survive where. So the big question is, after all this time, after a century of research, who actually won the debate? Well, the evidence today is pretty overwhelming. It really supports Henry Gleason. When scientists look at environmental gradients, like the changes in plants you see as you hike up a mountain, they see exactly what Gleason predicted. Species don't just appear and disappear in these neat little groups. Instead, each species kind of fades in and out on its own terms, based on its own individual needs. Okay, so if a community is really just an assemblage of individuals, does that mean every species has the same amount of influence? Not a chance. In fact, some species are way more important than others. So let's talk about two of these critical roles, the keystone species and the dominant species. First up, the keystone species, a brilliant concept from Robert Payne. This is a species whose impact on its community is absolutely massive, way, way bigger than you would ever expect based on how few of them there are. The classic example is the pea-star starfish. By eating mussels, it stops them from completely taking over the shoreline. This one act opens up space for tons of other species to live. If you remove that starfish, the whole system collapses. Biodiversity just plummets. And then, on the other hand, we have the dominant species. Now, these are the heavyweights. They get their influence simply by being the most common, or by having the most total mass. Think about the giant trees that make up the canopy in a forest. They literally control the light, the temperature, the humidity for every single thing living beneath them. They shape the entire habitat just by being there in huge numbers. So here's the key takeaway, and trust me, this is a point where a lot of people get mixed up. Do not assume that being abundant means you have the most impact. It's not that simple. A keystone species has low numbers, but its effect on the community structure is huge. A dominant species, in contrast, gets its influence from its sheer numbers and its control over resources like light and space. They're two totally different ways of being a power player in an ecosystem. So we've talked about the who, the key players in the community.
Now, let's talk about the where. Because communities aren't just a random jumble of species all thrown together. They actually have a physical structure, a kind of architecture. A fantastic example of this is the vertical layering, what ecologists call stratification, that we see in a forest. It's organized into these distinct levels, almost like floors in a building. You've got the towering trees of the emergent layer at the very top, peeking out above everyone else. Then you go down through the dense canopy, the understory, the shrub layer, and finally you reach the rich, bustling world of the forest floor. Each layer is its own little universe.
And this layering isn't just for looks, it has huge ecological consequences. By creating all these different microhabitats, it actually allows way more species to live together in the same place. Why? Because it allows for something called niche differentiation. Basically, species can specialize. They can carve out their own little role by living and hunting in different layers. This cuts down on direct competition, which leads to a massive boost in the community's overall biodiversity. It's brilliant.
All right, let's wrap this all up. Let's bring all these ideas together and really nail down the modern view of what an ecological community is.
If you only take away a few things from our chat today, let it be these key points. First, communities are best understood as flexible assemblages, not these rigid, tightly controlled superorganisms. Second, never ever confuse a dominant species with a keystone species. Tons of them doesn't always equal the most important. And finally, remember that the edges of communities and the way they change over time are way more gradual and flexible than those old theories ever imagined. And this brings us to one last, really amazing question to think about. If a community is really just this loose collection of individualistic species, just like Gleason suggested, then what explains the incredible patterns, the intricate structures, and the amazing stability we see all around us in nature every single day? That tension, that push and pull between individual freedom and collective order, is what continues to make community ecology one of the most exciting fields of study out there.